The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine down from the mountains, a mournful sigh through the darkening valley. Kenzo pulled his worn travelling cloak tighter, his gaze sweeping over the huddled rooftops of the town below. It clung to the mountainside like a stubborn fungus, smoke curling weakly from thatched roofs into the bruised twilight sky. Another town, another night's shelter sought. His steps were measured on the muddy track, the scabbard of his katana tied securely at his hip, a familiar weight that offered cold comfort. He wasn't looking for trouble. He rarely was, these days. Trouble, however, had a talent for finding those who carried swords, even Ronin, who wished only to pass through unnoticed. The town gate, crude timber bound with iron, stood open like a weary mouth. Beside it, a guard leaned on his yari, his eyes narrowed slits under the brim of his jingasa. Sergeant Mori, Kenzo noted from the insignia, his posture stiff with the petty authority of small places. Mori's gaze lingered on Kenzo, cataloguing the sword, the travel-stained clothes, the air of quiet competence that clung to him like dust. Kenzo offered a slight, non-committal nod and passed through, feeling the sergeant's suspicion follow him like a shadow. The air within the town felt thicker, heavier. Fear was a palpable presence, clinging to the rough-hewn walls of the houses, lurking in the averted eyes of the few villagers hurrying home before full dark. A sense of wrongness prickled at the back of Kenzo's neck, a familiar unease he'd learned to trust. He sought only an inn, a bowl of rice, a few hours of forgetfulness before moving on. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A commotion erupted from the small, muddy square ahead. Harsh voices, raised in anger, shattered the evening quiet. Kenzo slowed his pace, his hand instinctively resting near the hilt of his sword, a habit ingrained by years of vigilance. Two burly men, thugs dressed in rough, ill-fitting clothes, but carrying the swagger of unchecked power, were menacing a thin, elderly shopkeeper. They kicked over a basket of vegetables, scattering radishes and greens into the mud. "The magistrate's levy is due, old man," one snarled, shoving the shopkeeper hard against his flimsy stall. "Or perhaps you prefer a visit to his cells?" The old man trembled, pleading in a thin, reedy voice about a poor harvest, about taxes already paid. It was a scene Kenzo had witnessed variations of too many times in his wandering. Petty tyrants carving fiefdoms of fear under the guise of authority. He usually walked on. Involvement bred complication, complication bred danger, and danger stirred memories he fought daily to keep buried. But then he saw her. Standing frozen near the edge of the square, a young woman, slender as a willow reed, her sightless eyes wide with terror. Her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white. The raw fear radiating from her, the utter helplessness in her stance, struck a chord deep within him, a dissonant chime against the dull ache of his own past failures. He remembered other faces, other moments when he hadn't acted, when caution had become cowardice. The thugs advanced on the shopkeeper again, fists raised. Something in Kenzo snapped. He couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Enough. Kenzo's voice was quiet, yet it cut through the thugs' bluster. They turned, surprised, assessing him with disdain. "A ragged Ronin playing hero?" The first one sneered, hefting a heavy wooden club. "Mind your own business, stray dog, unless you want your teeth scattered." Kenzo didn't draw his sword. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but centered. The man has paid what he owes by the look of him. Leave him be. The second thug laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Magistrate Jinno makes the rules here, and we enforce them." He lunged, swinging the club clumsily. Kenzo moved with fluid economy, sidestepping the blow, his hand shooting out to grip the thug's wrist. A twist, a sharp application of pressure on a nerve cluster, and the club clattered to the ground as the man gasped in pain, stumbling back. The first thug roared and charged, fists flailing. Kenzo met the attack with calm precision, redirecting the blows, using the man's momentum against him. A swift strike to the side of the neck sent the thug sprawling into the mud, dazed and groaning. It was over in moments, efficient and almost silent, save for the gasps of the onlookers who had gathered at a safe distance. Kenzo glanced towards the young woman. She hadn't moved, but her head was tilted, listening intently, her body still rigid with fear. He retrieved the fallen club, tossing it dismissively aside. The thugs scrambled to their feet, glaring with impotent fury before backing away, muttering threats about reporting this to the magistrate. Kenzo watched them go, then turned to the shaken shopkeeper, helping him gather his scattered wares. He felt eyes on him again. Sergeant Mori had arrived, standing silently at the edge of the square, his expression unreadable. He hadn't intervened. He simply observed, a passive instrument of the power that allowed such brutality. Kenzo met his gaze briefly before turning his attention back to the blind young woman. Her terror seemed to have subsided slightly, replaced by a trembling uncertainty. He felt an unwelcome stirring of responsibility. Passing through was no longer an option. Kenzo found lodging easily enough, a small clean room in a modest inn near the edge of town, away from the main thoroughfare. The innkeeper, a stooped man with wary eyes, asked few questions, accepting Kenzo's payment with a mumbled word of thanks. Later, seeking a simple meal, Kenzo found himself near the small dwelling he'd seen the blind woman retreat towards after the incident in the square. It was little more than a hut, tucked away where the town met the encroaching forest. Smoke curled from its chimney, carrying the scent of wood smoke and simple broth. An elderly woman, her face a roadmap of hardship, but her eyes holding a spark of resilience, was tending a small patch of herbs outside. She looked up as Kenzo approached, her gaze sharp. "You are the Ronin from the square," she stated, not quite a question. Kenzo inclined his head. "I seek nothing, only to understand." The woman studied him for a long moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "My name is Fumi. The girl you saw, that is Aya, my granddaughter." She sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come inside. It is not safe to talk out here." The interior was sparse but tidy. Aya sat quietly by the small hearth, her hands resting in her lap. She turned her head slightly as they entered, acknowledging Kenzo's presence with a faint, almost imperceptible nod. Fumi motioned for Kenzo to sit on a worn floor cushion. Over cups of weak tea, Fumi spoke, her voice low and steady, recounting the town's slow descent into fear since Magistrate Jinno's arrival 2 years prior. He was charming at first, promising fairness, but soon his true nature emerged. Exorbitant taxes, levies on the timber from the surrounding forest, the town's lifeblood, that lined his pockets, not the regional daimyo's coffers. Those who protested disappeared or faced brutal retribution from his hired thugs. Fumi's voice grew heavy with sorrow as she spoke of Aya's family. Her son, Aya's father, had been a respected woodsman. He had tried to organize the villagers, to petition the magistrate about the unfair logging taxes that were ruining them. Jinno had made an example of him. Fumi recounted the day Jinno's men dragged Aya's father and mother from their home during a staged riot over forest access. Aya, hidden nearby, had witnessed it all. The shouts, the blows, the final, terrible silence as her father was struck down, her mother dragged away, never to be seen again. The shock, the horror of what she saw, it had stolen her sight. She woke days later, screaming, Fumi whispered, tears tracing paths down her wrinkled cheeks. But the world, it remained dark for her. The healers say her eyes are unharmed. It is her spirit, her memory, that refuses to see. Aya flinched slightly at the mention of that day, her hands tightening into fists. Kenzo felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The casual cruelty, the abuse of power, the innocent lives shattered. It echoed his own past, the faces of the merchant family he had failed, the disgrace that had driven him from his clan, from his life. He saw their faces superimposed on Aya's sightless ones. He had stood by then, bound by misplaced loyalty and fear. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The desire to simply pass through evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Magistrate Jinno," Kenzo said, his voice quiet but firm. "He lives in the large residence near the north gate?" Fumi nodded, her eyes searching his face. "It is heavily guarded. He is a dangerous man, Ronin-san. Powerful." Kenzo met her gaze. "Power built on fear is brittle." He rose. "Thank you for the tea, Fumi-san. Rest assured, I am not leaving just yet." He saw a flicker of desperate hope in the old woman's eyes. As he left, he felt Aya's unseen gaze follow him, a silent question hanging in the air. Current part characters 2188. Total characters 988. The following days saw Kenzo moving quietly through the town and its surroundings. He was a shadow, observing, listening. He saw Jinno's thugs patrolling, their arrogance unchecked. He saw the fear in the eyes of the farmers bringing their meagre produce to market, the way they flinched when the guards passed. He spent hours in the forest that climbed the mountainside behind the town. The signs were clear. Ancient trees felled carelessly, far more than any official quota would allow. Drag marks scarred the earth, leading towards a secluded track bypassing the main road. Jinno's private route for smuggling timber, no doubt. He learned that Jinno rarely left his residence, preferring to rule through his intermediaries and the ever-present threat of his guards, captained by Sergeant Mori. Kenzo saw Mori several times, always watchful, his face a mask of professional detachment. Yet, Kenzo detected faint cracks in the facade, a tightening of the jaw when witnessing the thug's cruelty, a flicker of unease in his eyes when Jinno's name was mentioned with fear. One afternoon, Mori sought Kenzo out near the inn. "Magistrate Jinno wishes to know your business here, Ronin," Mori said, his voice flat, official. "He finds your continued presence curious." Kenzo met his gaze calmly. "I am merely resting before continuing my journey. Does the magistrate concern himself with every traveller?" Mori shifted his weight. "He concerns himself with those who interfere with his administration, like disrupting the collection of levies." "I disrupted brutality," Kenzo corrected softly. "Is that part of the magistrate's administration?" Mori's eyes hardened, but a muscle twitched in his cheek. "You are treading dangerous ground. The magistrate has little patience." "Patience is often lacking in those who have much to hide," Kenzo replied evenly. He saw a flash of something, anger, resignation, in Mori's eyes before the mask slipped back into place. The sergeant gave a curt nod and turned away. The warning was clear. Jinno was aware of him and his tolerance was wearing thin. Kenzo knew he needed more than observations. He needed proof, something concrete to expose Jinno. Whispers in the tavern, fearful glances, illegally felled trees, these weren't enough to challenge a magistrate. He needed documents, ledgers, testimony. But the villagers were too terrified to speak openly. Jinno's grip was absolute. He focused his attention on Mori. The sergeant was the key, the potential weak link in Jinno's chain of command. Kenzo sought another encounter, finding Mori overseeing a patrol near the riverbank where logs were gathered. "Sergeant," Kenzo began, keeping his tone respectful, "a man of your position must carry a heavy burden, upholding the magistrate's law." Mori eyed him warily. "It is my duty." "Duty can be a heavy shield," Kenzo mused, seemingly watching the slow-moving water. "Sometimes it hides the man beneath. I knew samurai once, men bound by duty who turned a blind eye to injustice. It corroded them from within." Mori's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "What are you implying, Ronin?" "Only that true honor lies not just in obedience, but in upholding justice," Kenzo said, meeting Mori's gaze. "Even when it is difficult, even when it is dangerous." He saw the conflict flicker in Mori's eyes, the struggle between ingrained loyalty and a perhaps buried conscience. Mori didn't reply, just stared stonily ahead. Kenzo didn't push further. He had planted a seed. Whether it would take root remained to be seen. Jinno's response wasn't long in coming. That evening, as Kenzo returned to his inn, 3 figures detached themselves from the deep shadows of an alleyway. Not the clumsy thugs from the square, but lean, hard-eyed men, fellow Ronin by their look, hired swords. They moved with predatory silence, blocking his path. "The magistrate sends his regards," one hissed, drawing his blade. "He suggests you leave town. Permanently." Kenzo sighed inwardly. He had hoped to avoid this. His hand moved, not with the lightning speed of aggression, but with the deliberate grace of long practice. His katana cleared its scabbard with a soft whisper of steel. The narrow alley limited maneuverability, forcing close-quarters combat. The first Ronin lunged, his blade aimed at Kenzo's chest. Kenzo deflected the thrust with a precise parry, the clang of steel echoing between the buildings. He flowed around the attack, his own blade tracing a swift arc that forced the Ronin back. The other 2 attacked simultaneously, trying to flank him. Kenzo moved like water, shifting his weight, using minimal movements to counter their strikes. His style wasn't flashy, it was efficient, honed by experience, designed to end fights quickly, decisively. He disarmed one attacker with a sharp blow to the wrist, sending the sword skittering across the wet cobblestones. He disabled the second with a pommel strike to the temple that dropped the man unconscious. The first Ronin, seeing his companions fall, hesitated, fear replacing aggression in his eyes. Kenzo pressed his advantage, a series of swift feints forcing the man to overcommit, leaving an opening. Kenzo didn't strike a killing blow. A flat blade strike to the side of the head was enough. The man crumpled. Breathing slightly harder, Kenzo surveyed the scene. A sharp pain flared in his left arm, a shallow cut incurred during the initial exchange. Nothing serious, but a reminder of the stakes. He sheathed his katana, the click loud in the sudden silence. He knew Jinno would escalate further. Simple intimidation had failed. Next time, the magistrate wouldn't settle for warnings. He needed that proof, and he needed it soon. He made his way back to Fumi's hut, drawn by an instinct for sanctuary. Fumi gasped when she saw the blood staining his sleeve. While Aya sat nearby, listening intently, Fumi cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced hands, her touch gentle but firm. "You cannot fight them all, Kenzo-san," she murmured, her brow furrowed with worry. "He will not stop." "I know," Kenzo said, meeting Aya's unseen gaze across the small room. "That is why I must find the truth hidden in his fortress." Aya reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his bandaged arm, a silent gesture of concern, of connection, that strengthened his resolve more than any words could. Current part characters, 2347, total characters, 16,425. The magistrate's residence, his yashiki, stood on a slight rise overlooking the town, its whitewashed walls and imposing gatehouse a stark symbol of his power. Kenzo spent the next day observing it from a distance, hidden amongst the trees on the opposite slope. Guards patrolled the perimeter, Mori among them, his expression grim. Getting inside wouldn't be easy, and getting out with proof would be harder still. He needed a distraction, an opportunity, and perhaps a sliver of help from a conflicted sergeant. He needed Jinno's ledgers, the records that would detail the extortion, the illegal timber sales, the network of corruption. Such things were usually kept close, likely in Jinno's private study. As dusk approached, the sky began to darken ominously. Heavy clouds rolled in from the peaks, pregnant with rain. Wind began to whip through the trees, carrying the first drops. A storm was coming, the perfect cover. Kenzo made his preparations, dressing in dark, functional clothing, securing his sword, and carrying only essential tools: lockpicks, a small pry bar, rope. Before heading towards the yashiki under the cloak of the gathering storm, he sought out Mori one last time. He found him near the barracks, overseeing the changing of the guard as the wind howled around them. "Sergeant," Kenzo said, his voice barely audible over the wind, "a storm is a time for vigilance. Weak points can be exposed." Mori turned, rain plastering strands of hair to his forehead. His face was taut. "The magistrate's residence is secure." "Is it?" Kenzo pressed gently. "Or does duty sometimes require looking away, perhaps near the old servants' entrance on the east wall? The lock there, it has always been troublesome, hasn't it?" He held Mori's gaze for a heartbeat, searching for any sign. Mori's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered almost imperceptibly towards the east side of the compound. He said nothing, merely grunted and turned back to his men, shouting orders against the rising wind. It wasn't confirmation, but it was enough. A gamble, perhaps, but the only one Kenzo had. The storm broke with full fury as Kenzo reached the yashiki's outer wall. Rain lashed down, turning the ground to slick mud, and thunder cracked overhead, masking any sound he might make. He moved swiftly through the driving rain to the east wall, finding the small, seldom-used servants' gate. Mori hadn't directly confirmed, but hadn't denied either. The lock was old, stiff, but yielded surprisingly quickly to Kenzo's picks. Had Mori ensured it remained troublesome? Or was it merely neglect? Kenzo didn't dwell on it. He slipped inside the compound, melting into the shadows of the garden. The main building loomed ahead, lights glowing dimly in a few windows despite the storm. He skirted the edge of the manicured garden, avoiding the gravel paths, his movements silent as the rain itself. He knew the layout roughly from his observations. Jinno's private quarters and study were likely on the upper floor, facing the relative quiet of the rear garden. Reaching the building, he found a sturdy drain pipe and began to climb, the wet metal slick under his grip. The wind tore at him, threatening to rip him from his perch, but he ascended steadily, testing each hold. He reached a narrow balcony outside the upper floor, screened by bamboo blinds rattling in the wind. He listened intently. Muffled voices from within, then silence. He carefully pried open the shuttered window, slipped inside and found himself in a corridor, dimly lit by a single oil lamp swaying in the drafts. He moved cautiously, testing each floorboard, his senses straining against the roar of the storm outside. He located the study quickly. A heavy wooden door, slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, he saw the room was empty, dominated by a large desk littered with scrolls and brushes. Lacquered boxes lined the shelves. This had to be it. He slipped inside, closing the door softly behind him. Working quickly by the flickering lamplight, he began searching the boxes. Most contained official documents, tax records seemingly in order, mundane correspondence. Then, in a heavy locked chest hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the desk, he found it. A ledger bound in dark leather. He forced the lock. Inside, meticulous columns detailed names, dates, exorbitant sums extorted, notations of timber shipments marked private account. It was the proof he needed, damning evidence of Jinno's crimes. He tucked the ledger securely inside his tunic just as footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. The door slid open abruptly. Magistrate Jinno stood there, silhouetted against the corridor light, his silken robes immaculate despite the storm raging outside. His eyes, cold and reptilian, fixed on Kenzo, then flickered to the disturbed floorboard, the open chest. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly replaced by icy fury. "So, the stray dog has teeth after all," Jinno hissed, his voice dangerously soft. He clapped his hands sharply. "Guards!" Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. Kenzo drew his katana, the rasp of steel barely audible above the thunder. There was no escape route back the way he came. Jinno stepped aside as two guards burst in, swords drawn. Kenzo met their charge in the confined space. Furniture crashed, scrolls scattered. He moved with desperate precision, needing to incapacitate them quickly. He dispatched the first guard with a swift cut to the sword arm, the second with a disabling blow to the leg. But more were coming. He could hear them shouting in the corridor. Jinno watched, a cruel smile playing on his lips, making no move to intervene himself. Kenzo backed towards the window, the ledger feeling heavy against his ribs. He needed to get out. He glanced towards the doorway just as Sergeant Mori arrived, sword drawn, blocking the exit. Mori's face was pale, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. Kenzo cornered, the fallen guards, Jinno's triumphant smirk. "Kill him, Sergeant!" Jinno commanded, his voice sharp. "He attacked me!" "He is a thief and an assassin." Mori hesitated, his gaze locked with Kenzo's. Kenzo saw the war raging within him, duty versus conscience, fear versus honor. This was the moment. Kenzo braced himself, ready to fight his way through if necessary. Mori took a half-step forward, raising his sword as if to obey. Then, in a movement that seemed almost accidental, his foot caught on the edge of an overturned brazier, sending it clattering loudly across the floor, embers scattering. In the brief moment of distraction, as the remaining guards flinched and Jinno cursed, Kenzo acted. He hurled himself backwards through the window, shattering the screen and wood, tumbling onto the rain-slicked balcony. Kenzo landed heavily but rolled, absorbing the impact. Below, the garden was chaos, guards alerted by the commotion running towards the building. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled to the edge of the balcony, vaulted over the railing and caught the drain pipe, sliding rapidly down the wet metal. He hit the muddy ground, ignoring the jolt that shot up his legs. Shouts erupted from above and behind him. He sprinted across the garden, heading back towards the east gate, the ledger secure beneath his tunic. He risked a glance back. Figures appeared on the balcony, Jinno among them, pointing and shouting orders. Mori was not visible. Had his accident bought Kenzo enough time, or had it sealed his own fate? There was no time to ponder. Kenzo reached the servants' gate, slipped through, and disappeared into the storm-lashed darkness outside the walls, the roar of the wind and rain swallowing the sounds of pursuit. He didn't stop running until he reached the relative safety of the forest edge, his lungs burning, soaked to the bone, but clutching the damning evidence. He found shelter beneath a thick canopy of ancient pines, the rain drumming overhead. He needed to get the ledger to someone Jinno couldn't control. Rumor had spoken of a Metsuke, an inspector from the regional capital, due to pass through the area soon on a circuit tour. It was a long shot, but perhaps his only one. He spent a cold, wet night hidden, waiting for dawn, the leather-bound ledger a heavy weight against his chest, the weight of proof, the weight of hope for Aya and the town. He thought of Mori, wondering about the consequences of that split-second decision, that fumbled brazier. An accident or a deliberate act of defiance? Kenzo suspected the latter, a small spark of honor finally igniting in the sergeant. Luck, or perhaps fate, favored Kenzo. News reached the town the next day, carried by drenched travelers. The circuit inspector, delayed by the storm, would be arriving within 2 days. Jino, furious at Kenzo's escape and the theft of his ledger, had locked down the town, his remaining guards patrolling aggressively, searching houses, questioning everyone. Fear hung heavier than ever. Kenzo knew he couldn't risk entering the town himself. He needed a messenger. He made his way cautiously back towards Fumi's hut under cover of darkness. He found Fumi waiting, her face etched with anxiety. Aya sat nearby, her head tilted as if listening for his footsteps. "He escaped," Fumi whispered, relief warring with fear in her voice. "Jino is furious. His men are everywhere." Kenzo explained the situation, showing her the ledger. "This must reach the inspector when he arrives. It is the only way." Fumi looked at the book, then at Kenzo. "It is too dangerous for you. Sergeant Mori was arrested this morning. Jino accused him of aiding your escape." Kenzo felt a pang of guilt, but also respect for Mori's sacrifice. "Then his risk must not be in vain," Kenzo said firmly. "Fumi-san, I need your help. Can you find someone trustworthy, someone brave enough to deliver this?" Fumi hesitated for only a moment. "There is, the old shopkeeper, the one you helped in the square. Jino's men roughed him up again after you left, but he holds no love for the magistrate. He owes you." It was risky, but Kenzo agreed. Fumi concealed the ledger within a basket of preserved vegetables and set out before dawn, a frail but determined figure melting into the pre-dawn gloom. Kenzo could only wait, hidden in the forest, trusting in the courage of an old woman and a grateful shopkeeper. The next 2 days crawled by. Kenzo watched the road from his hiding place. Finally, a small procession appeared, the inspector's palanquin, accompanied by his own samurai attendants. They entered the town. Hours passed in agonizing slowness. Then commotion erupted from the direction of the yashiki, shouts, running figures. Kenzo saw the inspector's attendants, stern-faced and efficient, escorting a bound magistrate Jino from his residence. Jino's face was a mask of disbelief and rage, his fine robes dishevelled. His reign of terror was over. A wave of relief washed over Kenzo, so profound it left him weak-kneed. He watched as Jino was taken away, his remaining thugs quickly rounded up or scattering into the hills. The inspector's men moved with brisk authority, restoring order. Word spread through the town like wildfire. People emerged from their homes, hesitant at first, then with growing boldness. There was no open celebration. Fear lingered like a bad taste, but the oppressive weight lifted from the air was undeniable. Later that day, Kenzo cautiously approached Fumi's hut. Fumi met him at the door, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It is done, Kenzo-san," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The shopkeeper delivered it. The inspector listened. Justice." She couldn't finish the word. Kenzo stepped inside. Aya was standing near the open doorway, bathed in the soft afternoon light filtering through the trees. She turned her head towards him as he entered. Her face, though still marked by past sorrow, held a new calmness, a release from the constant tension of fear. The source of her trauma, the embodiment of the terror that had stolen her sight, was gone. Kenzo knew her blindness wouldn't vanish overnight. The wounds of the spirit healed slowly, painstakingly, but the poison had been drawn. The healing could begin. He saw the faint tremor in her hands subside. She took a tentative step towards him, her hand outstretched, not in fear but in recognition. Her fingers brushed his scarred hand, tracing the faint white line across his knuckles, the mark of his past failure. "Kenzo-san," she whispered, her voice clearer, stronger than before. "Arigato. Thank you." In that simple word, Kenzo felt a measure of peace settle over him, a quiet easing of the guilt he had carried for so long. He hadn't erased his past, but he had confronted its echo. He had acted. He had made a difference. Justice, fragile and hard-won, had returned to this small corner of the world. The regional daimyo appointed a new administrator, an older, more sober man tasked with repairing the damage Jino had wrought. Investigations were conducted, stolen property returned where possible, and the illegal logging operations dismantled. The forest began to breathe again. Sergeant Mori, Kenzo learned, had been released after the inspector's investigation confirmed his passive role in Kenzo's escape and his subsequent unjust imprisonment by Jinno. Stripped of his rank but spared further punishment, he quietly left the town, seeking a new life elsewhere, forever marked by his choices. Kenzo remained, helping Fumi and Aya repair their small home, ensuring they had enough firewood for the coming colder months. He spoke little, but his presence was a quiet reassurance. He watched Aya slowly unfurl like a flower starved of sunlight finally finding warmth. She began spending more time outdoors, her face turned towards the sounds of the forest, her hands exploring the textures of bark and stone with growing confidence. Her sight had not returned. Perhaps it never would, but the crushing weight of terror had lifted. She smiled sometimes, a small hesitant curve of her lips that lit her face. Kenzo found himself reluctant to leave. The road called, as it always did, but the thought of wandering felt different now. Less like escape, more like abandonment.